Surjeet Kaur, once the pride of Southall's tight-knit Indian community, and Harjeevan Brar, the devoted husband who trusted her completely, seemed like the perfect couple, until greed, deception, and a secret alliance with the elusive Manroop Dhaliwal turned their lives into the center of one of the UK's most shocking murder cases. Surjeet Kaur had built an image in Southall that many admired. Neighbors saw her as the picture of grace and respectability, a woman who kept her home spotless, cooked lavish meals for community gatherings, and always appeared in elegant silk suits with gold jewelry that glimmered under the Gurdwara lights. To the outside world, she was the perfect wife to Harjeevan Brar, a soft-spoken accountant known for his discipline and dedication to his work. They lived in a semi-detached house on a quiet suburban street, its neat lawn and flower beds suggesting stability and pride. But the carefully maintained facade was only a thin layer hiding a life under immense strain. For years, their marriage had weathered the ordinary ups and downs, but the last 2 years had been different. Harjeevan's accounting firm had taken a devastating hit after several key clients pulled out, leaving him scrambling for smaller contracts and part-time consultancy work. At the same time, Surjeet's fondness for small bets at the casino had turned into an all-consuming addiction. She justified it to herself as a way to win back what they had lost. But her winnings were rare and her losses relentless. Quietly, without telling her husband, she had borrowed thousands from friends, high-interest lenders, and even pawned family heirlooms to cover her growing debt. The tension in the Brar household became noticeable to anyone who looked closely enough. Though Harjeevan rarely raised his voice, the arguments were becoming more frequent. They fought over bills, over mysterious withdrawals from their joint account, and over the pile of unopened letters that Surjeet kept tucked away in a drawer. She hated the way he looked at her now, with suspicion instead of affection, and she hated even more the feeling that she was losing control over her carefully arranged life. Despite the financial pressure, Surjeet insisted on maintaining appearances. She attended charity dinners, made generous donations to religious causes, and bought expensive outfits for public events. She understood the unspoken currency of reputation in her community. If she looked successful, people would believe she was. Harjeevan saw through it but lacked the energy to challenge her in public. He had started to withdraw, spending more time away from home, perhaps to avoid the atmosphere of tension that seemed to cling to every corner of their house. By the summer of 2018, the situation had grown critical. The loan sharks she had borrowed from were no longer content with her promises and polite delays. One man had followed her home one evening, standing across the street until she went inside, a silent warning of what could come next. She felt trapped, hemmed in by threats from all sides, her creditors, her husband's growing suspicions, and the inevitability of her lies coming to light. Late at night, when Harjeevan was asleep, Surjeet would sit alone in the kitchen, staring at the rows of unpaid bills and the reminders from debt collection agencies. Her thoughts shifted from panic to calculation. She knew that if the truth came out, she would lose everything: her home, her standing in the community, even the people who pretended to be her friend. Her mind wandered to the one thing that could solve her problems in a single irreversible stroke: the substantial life insurance policy that Harjeevan had taken out years earlier, meant to protect her if anything happened to him. It was then, in those solitary hours, that the first dark seeds of a plan began to take root. She told herself it was just a thought, a passing fantasy born from desperation, but she kept coming back to it. With each unpaid bill and each cold silence from her husband, the idea became less shocking and more logical in her mind. She started to think about the possibility not as an outrageous act, but as a solution. Surjeet understood one thing clearly: if she acted, she would need to be careful. She could not afford mistakes. She began to pay more attention to the people around her, looking for someone who might help her without asking too many questions. Her public life carried on as usual, but beneath the surface, she was moving pieces in her mind, imagining how she might turn the image of the perfect wife into the mask that would hide the truth. What she didn't yet realize was that once she stepped onto this path, there would be no way. The life she had so carefully constructed was already crumbling, and soon it would shatter completely. By the early weeks of September 2018, Surjeet's financial spiral had reached a depth from which she could see no return. The gambling had gone far beyond the occasional evening out. It was now an almost nightly escape into the flashing lights and false promises of winning big. The numbers on her debts no longer frightened her. They had passed the point of reality, almost feeling abstract. What terrified her more was Harjeevan's growing awareness. She had been forging his signature for months, taking out loans in his name to keep the collectors at bay. But even her most convincing explanations were beginning to sound thin. The confrontation that changed everything came quietly, without shouting, but with a tone in Harjeevan's voice that cut deeper than any insult. He had found a letter about a loan he never applied for. He told her that once his new job came through, he would be filing for divorce. The word divorce echoed in her head for days afterward. It wasn't just about losing her marriage. Divorce would drag her lies into the open, leaving her humiliated in front of the entire community. She saw herself cast out of the circles where she once commanded admiration, reduced to a cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones. It was around this time that she crossed paths again with Manroop. She had known him years earlier, through distant acquaintances, but their lives had taken different directions. He had always been the type who thrived in gray areas, a man who claimed to own several small businesses, though no one could say exactly what they were. His reputation carried murmurs of cash deals, questionable consulting, and connections to people who solved problems without involving the police. When she ran into him at a suburban cafe, the kind that stayed open late and catered to quiet meetings, something about the timing felt almost fated. At first their conversations were casual, filled with updates about old acquaintances and harmless talk about the economy. But as the weeks passed, the topics shifted. She started mentioning her difficult situation in vague terms, testing his reaction. Manroop didn't offer sympathy. He offered possibility. He spoke about removing obstacles and finding ways out, always in indirect phrases that made their meaning clear without saying anything that could be repeated. Surjeet began meeting him regularly, always in places where no one from her close social circle would see her. The more they spoke, the more she found herself voicing thoughts she had previously kept locked in her head. She spoke of fear, of desperation, of not being able to face the humiliation she believed was coming. In her mind, she justified these meetings as exploring her options, but deep down she knew she was already stepping past a moral line she could never uncross. Manroop, for his part, never pushed. He simply let her talk, occasionally offering a suggestion that sounded less like advice and more like an invitation to take action. The unspoken idea hung between them, growing heavier each time they met. By the third week, she was asking him quiet, practical questions, the kind of questions no innocent person would need to ask. Her public life remained untouched by these hidden conversations. She still smiled at neighbors, still attended religious gatherings, and still posted cheerful photographs on social media. But now, every time she looked at Harjeevan, she saw not just her husband, but a problem to be solved. She began to observe his routines more closely, what time he left for work, what time he returned, when he was alone, when the neighbors were least likely to notice unusual activity. Late one night she sat at the kitchen table, replaying in her mind the things Manroop had said. He had told her that every problem had a price, and if she was willing to pay it, the problem could go away forever. She found herself wondering what exactly that price would be in money, and in conscience. But her conscience had been eroded by months of desperation, fear, and quiet calculation. By the end of September, she had stopped asking herself whether she would go through with it. The only question left was the night of November 14, 2018, began like countless others in the Brar household, yet it carried a tension that was almost tangible. A steady drizzle fell over Southall, coating the streets in a slick shine under the dim glow of street lamps. Harjeevan returned home later than usual, his coat damp from the rain, his movements tired but deliberate. He had been at a second-round interview for a position that could have helped ease their financial strain. Surjeet greeted him with an unusual calmness, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. On the kitchen table, dinner was already prepared, fragrant rice, spiced lentils, and a dish of curried chicken. Harjeevan ate quietly, unaware that the careful atmosphere in the room was not a reconciliation but a staging. Surjeet moved around the kitchen with a calculated grace, pouring water into his glass, refilling his plate and keeping her tone light. Yet beneath her steady exterior, her mind was fixed on the plan she had rehearsed again and again. Manroop had told her exactly what needed to happen, and how quickly it must be done. Tonight was the night she had chosen. There would be no turning back. By the time the dishes were cleared, the drizzle outside had grown heavier. Harjeevan moved to the living room, settling into his favorite armchair, his phone in hand. Surjeet lingered in the kitchen, her heart pounding as she reached for the heavy brass statue she had taken from the top of a display shelf earlier in the evening. It was a decorative piece, a gift from a cousin years ago, but tonight it was a weapon. She walked into the living room quietly, her steps muffled by the carpet. In a swift motion, she brought the statue down against the back of his head. The sound was dull but final. Harjeevan slumped forward without a word, his phone sliding from his hand to the floor. For a few moments she stood frozen, the weight of what she had done pressing against her chest, her breathing sharp and uneven. Manroop arrived less than 10 minutes later, wearing dark clothes and gloves. He moved with a calm efficiency that unsettled her. This was not his first time doing something like this. Together they lifted Harjeevan's limp body, struggling against the dead weight. The rain outside masked the sound of their movements, and the quiet street offered no prying eye. They dragged him to the garage, where the silver sedan waited with its boot open. The smell of oil and cold air mixed with the faint metallic scent of blood. Once the body was in the car, Surjeet quickly wiped down the handles and any surface they had touched without gloves. They climbed into the front seats, she in the passenger seat, Manroop at the wheel, and drove off into the wet, empty streets. Her hands trembled in her lap, but she kept her eyes forward. The route they took was one she had memorized, a drive to the outskirts of London, toward an abandoned industrial area she had never visited before. The warehouse was exactly as Manroop had described, dark, silent and smelling of damp and rust. Broken windows allowed the wind to whistle through, carrying the sound of water dripping from the leaking roof. They pulled the body from the boot and laid it in a far corner, covering it hastily with old tarpaulins and discarded cardboard. It was a crude concealment, but Manroop assured her it would be enough for now. The drive back was silent, except for the hum of the tires on wet asphalt. Surjeet stared out the window, the streetlights blurring into streaks of gold against the black night. She tried to steady her breathing, convincing herself that the hardest part was over, that she would return home to a house where the problem had been removed. Yet beneath that thin layer of relief, a cold unease began to settle. The act itself had been fast, but its consequences were only beginning, and deep down she sensed that what had just been set into motion would not stay hidden forever. When Harjeevan's absence was first noticed, it didn't immediately set off alarm bells. He had occasionally stayed out late for work or met with friends without mentioning it, but by the next morning, when his phone went unanswered, and no one had heard from him, the worry began to spread. Surjeet played her role with perfection. She called neighbors to ask if they had seen him, left worried voicemails for his colleagues, and even went to the police station to file a missing person report. Her voice trembled in just the right places. Her eyes welled with tears at the thought of her husband, possibly being hurt. The community rallied behind her. Friends organized small search groups, checking parks, bus stops, and local cafes. Posters with Harjeevan's face appeared on lampposts and shop windows within days. The sympathy poured in. Home-cooked meals, offers to accompany her to the police, and constant prayers at the Gurdwara. To most, she was the image of a devoted wife enduring a nightmare. Inside, however, she felt a sense of control return. With each day that passed without discovery, her confidence grew. Detective Alan Greaves, the officer assigned to the case, approached it methodically. His first step was to trace Harjeevan's last known movements. Witnesses confirmed he had been seen leaving work the night he disappeared. Traffic cameras showed his car entering their neighborhood around 10:30 p.m. But curiously, it was seen leaving just over an hour later. There was no record of it returning. That detail, small as it seemed, placed the first seed of suspicion in Greaves' mind. Surjeet was questioned early in the investigation. She spoke softly, sticking to the story she had rehearsed. Harjeevan had come home tired, eaten dinner, and gone out again for a meeting he didn't explain. She claimed she went to bed assuming he'd be. Her tone was calm, her answers consistent, but there was something about her measured delivery that Greaves found unusual. He made a note to revisit her timeline later. The breakthrough came when police accessed further CCTV footage from cameras positioned along major roads, leaving south. One grainy clip captured Harjeevan's silver sedan around midnight on the night he vanished, heading toward an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. The video quality was poor, but it showed two figures in the front seats, neither of whom could be identified clearly. The driver appeared broader in build than Harjeevan, and the passenger's profile matched Surjeet's height and hair. Phone records provided the next critical link. On the night in question, Surjeet's phone pinged cell towers near the industrial zone between midnight and 12. Manroop Dhaliwal's phone had done the same. When questioned, Manroop initially claimed he hadn't seen Surjeet in months, but under further pressure, his story began to crack. Detectives also traced his vehicle to multiple visits, to the same cafe where Surjeet had been seen in the weeks before the disappearance. The investigation intensified. A search warrant for the industrial warehouse was granted, and within hours, officers entered the dark, damp building. In the far corner, beneath layers of rotting tarpaulin, they found Harjeevan's body. The scene was grim, the air thick with the smell of decay and rust. Forensic teams moved in quickly, gathering evidence. Among the debris, they recovered a single latex glove. Laboratory testing revealed traces of Surjeet's DNA on the inside, and Harjeevan's blood on the outside. News of the discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The grieving wife's mask began to slip under the weight of mounting evidence. Detective Greaves requested a second interview with Surjeet, this time with a firmer tone and detailed questions. Her answers faltered under the pressure. She stumbled over dates, contradicted herself about her whereabouts, and grew visibly agitated when shown the CCTV images. What had once seemed like a tragic disappearance was now unraveling into a calculated act of murder. The woman the community had rallied around was no longer seen as a victim. She was becoming the prime suspect. And as the pieces fell into place, it became clear to the investigators that Surjeet's perfect performance had been nothing more than a carefully crafted cover for a crime she thought she could bury forever. The trial of Surjeet Kaur began in March 2020, drawing intense media attention from across the UK and beyond. The courtroom was packed each day with journalists, community members, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness the downfall of the woman, once held up as an example of grace and respectability. She sat in the dock wearing simple clothes, her hair pulled back, her expression carefully neutral. Gone were the silks and jewelry that had been her armor in public life. Now every eye in the room was fixed on her, searching for cracks in the facade. The prosecution's case was methodical, laying out each piece of evidence with deliberate precision. They began with the financial motive, introducing bank statements, forged loan applications, and gambling debts that painted a picture of a woman drowning in obligations she could never repay. Witnesses testified about her frequent visits to casinos and her desperate borrowing from friends and lenders. The life insurance policy worth £250,000 loomed large in the background of their argument, a sum that in the prosecution's view, explained the cold efficiency of the crime. Detective Alan Greaves took the stand to describe the timeline investigators had pieced together. He spoke of the CCTV footage, showing Harjeevan's car leaving their street, the phone records placing both Surjeet and Manroop near the warehouse, and the discovery of the latex glove carrying her DNA. The jury listened intently, their faces tightening as the details stacked up. Then came the most damning testimony of all, Manroop Dhaliwal himself. Manroop, wearing a prison-issued suit and speaking in a low voice, admitted his role in disposing of the body. He claimed Surjeet had approached him with a promise of £20,000 from the insurance payout in exchange for his help. He described their meetings in the cafe, the drive to the warehouse, and her calm demeanor even after the killing. In return for his cooperation, he had been offered a reduced sentence, a fact the defense tried to use to discredit his account, but his description of events matched the forensic evidence in almost every detail. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Manroop, with his criminal connections, had both the means and the motive to frame Surjeet. They painted her as a woman trapped by her circumstances, manipulated by a man who saw her vulnerability and exploited. They questioned the reliability of the CCTV images, and suggested that the DNA on the glove could have been transferred there under innocent circumstances. But the weight of the evidence was too great. Over the course of the trial, the image of the grieving wife had been dismantled piece by piece, replaced with that of a calculating woman willing to sacrifice her husband's life to save her own comfort and reputation. The jurors deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty of murder. The day of sentencing was heavy with tension. When the judge spoke, his words were measured but unflinching. He described Surjeet as manipulative, remorseless, and driven purely by selfish gain. He noted that she had not only taken a life, but also betrayed the trust of those who had cared for her most. He sentenced her to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 22 years before she could be considered for release. With that decision, Surjeet Kaur became the first Indian woman in UK history to receive a life sentence for murder. As she was led away, she did not cry or plead. She kept her head high, her face expressionless, but the world she had tried so hard to control was gone forever. In prison, her once polished image meant nothing. She was no longer the elegant hostess, or the admired community figure. She was just another inmate, identified by a number instead of a name. The community she had deceived struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the killer revealed in court. Her story became a grim reminder that beneath the most polished surfaces, darkness can grow unnoticed, until it breaks through in the most shocking of ways. The name Surjeet Kaur would forever be tied not to respectability, but to betrayal, greed, and the irreversible act that had destroyed everything.